Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 18th Annual Goldstick Lecture. We're going to get started in a few minutes as everyone takes their seat, and we'll start with our land acknowledgement statement.
As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign has a responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists. In order to remind ourselves and our community, we begin with this statement. We are currently on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. It is necessary for us to acknowledge these Native nations and for us to work with them as we move forward as an institution. Over the next 150 years, we will be a vibrant community inclusive of all our differences, with Native peoples at the core of our efforts.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 18th Goldstick Family Lecture in the study of communication disorders, made possible by the generosity of Philip and the late Beverly Goldstick. Let me take this opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Cristala Musa, and I have the privilege of serving as the new Dean of the College of Education here at the University of Illinois. I'm excited to be joining you today for this annual lecture. Today, we join over 200 participants from across the nation, in person and online, to hear from a leading scholar in the field of special education. What is more exciting is that our speaker, Dr. Jamie Peterson, is a College of Education alum and a former Goldstick scholar herself. Dr. Peterson joins us today from North Carolina State University, and the title of her talk is Strengthening Agency, Advocacy, and Access Among Historically Marginalized Families Supporting Autistic Children. This annual event would not be possible without the generous support of the Goldstick family, who identified a need and made a difference, giving students, scholars, and practitioners the opportunity for personal and professional growth. As of this academic year, the Goldstick family has supported 22 fellowships, 12 research teams, and 4 scholars in the field of special education. This gift has had a global impact on the field of special education, with past recipients holding scholarly appointments around the world, including the United States, Spain, and Chile. Thank you to Phil and the Goldstick family for your generous support you have shown to the College of Education over the years. We're grateful for your continuous dedication to supporting special education research. So thank you all for being here.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cheryl Light Schreiner, and I'm one of the newest Goldstick scholars. And I'm very, very happy to have this opportunity to represent the Goldstick family and to help with an event like this. Thank you, Dean Musa. And thank you, Phil, Karen, Gail, and the rest of all of the family for your commitment and dedication to the work we do in the area of communication disorders. It is my sincere honor to hold the title of Goldstick Scholar, I already told you that, beginning in the early spring of 2022. In addition to hosting this wonderful event, the Goldstick family provides support to doctoral students who have research and professional interest in improving the lives of individuals with communication needs, similar to Marissa Zellinger. And you saw a slideshow of many of those folks earlier. Marissa is the daughter of Karen and Alan and granddaughter of Phil and the late Beverly Goldstick. I will be announcing this year's Goldstick Fellows and Zellinger Research Award recipients later this afternoon. I want to direct you to the QR code, which is on the inside of your program. And if you use that code, you can submit a question for our guest speaker. And if you are a student and you're required to be here by some instructor somewhere, you can also prove that you were here by signing into that. So I encourage you to do that, but also to ask a question. We might have time for 1, 2, maybe 3. It just depends on how it goes this afternoon for those questions. But I am going to compile the questions and present them to Jamie, and at some point we may talk about how we might be able to make a Q&A kind of available to folks. So please use that code throughout the afternoon. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Marissa's mother, Karen, to share a few remarks.
Good afternoon. It's really so nice to be with everyone today in person at the annual Goldstick Lecture after several years of virtual programming. My sister and I are indebted to our parents, Beverly and Phil Goldstick, for their generous gifts that include sponsorship of this annual lecture, scholarships to graduate students that perform research, and other important work in the College of Education. Of course, the inspiration for the multi-pronged gifts is our daughter, Marissa, who endures Rett syndrome. Marissa is now 35 years old, and this is the 18th annual lecture. Time really does go by so quickly. Communication is key for all of us, and Marissa's disorder hinders her from communicating her thoughts, desires, distress, and more. Because of this, Marissa continues to use an iPad app called Touch Chat to communicate some information in her day at her community day program. And staff that work with her help her access information that helps her stay in tune with her peers. Telling a joke each morning is one thing that she shares from the communication device and app. We are continuing to train staff so they are comfortable with accessing the device for programming, as well as assisting Marissa for easy usage. Additionally, Marissa is encouraged to respond verbally, even though it's very hard for her and she needs prompting to do so. One of your very own students here in the College of Education is Anna Fuchsen, who's here today in the audience. She worked with Marissa when she was in high school. Anna is here, and she visited Marissa once a week in Marissa's house, which is a group home, for a full year, and always brought great ideas of activities to do with her and engage her to the fullest. Even at her young age, Anna knew that she wanted to focus her career in special education and was completely comfortable working with individuals with varying special needs. I encouraged her to seek the University of Illinois for her college of choice, and I'm so glad that she did, and that her academic career thus far has been so successful. We are so proud that Anna will be graduating with her undergraduate degree this coming spring. Stand up, Anna. She's in the back row. She's sitting with her friends from her cohort. Today's lecture from Dr. Jamie Peterson will be extremely interesting and pertinent to today's challenges within the special needs community. Dr. Peterson, as you had heard earlier, was a Goldstick Scholar while she was here as a student. My family and I are honored to be gathering together on campus, and thank you for being with us today. Thank you.
have an important task here. Hopefully I can do it. It's not a Mac. Is it the one at the top?
This last one down.
Right here?
Yeah.
Don't know how to click it. Is that the right one? Okay. I'll, slideshow, will you do it in the slideshow mode? All right. Sorry. I'm a Mac person through and through. I want to thank the Goldstick family again for this opportunity to bring another highly regarded scholar in communication disorders to our campus to share her expertise with us. We're really excited to have her here. This annual lecture is just one of a number of gifts that the Goldstick family have contributed to the University of Illinois community. Dr. Jamie Peterson has been an assistant professor within the Department of Teacher Education and Learning Sciences within the College of Education at North Carolina State University since 2017. Prior to this, Dr. Peterson was a doctoral student within our very own Department of Special Education here at the university and received the Goldstick Fellowship to support her research. So what goes around comes around. She has a special designation as our first returning Goldstick Fellow to serve as a Goldstick speaker. In the years following her doctoral program, Dr. Peterson has continued to conduct research, obtain grants, and publish her work. There are too many accomplishments and honors to mention this afternoon, but I would like to mention a few. She is a principal investigator for an Institute of Education Sciences Early Career Development and Mentoring grant called Developing and Refining a Parent Training to Improve Outcomes for African American Children with Autism. She is a co-PI for a National Science Foundation grant called Developing and Testing Innovations, Connecting Students with Autism to Geospatial and Data Science Careers. She was an invited panelist for the White House Initiative on Advancing Educational Equity, Excellence, and Economic Opportunity for Black Americans and the Institute of Education Science in a session called Black Voices in Education Research, supporting Black students across the education sciences. Dr. Peterson is also an elected member-at-large and diversity committee chair of the Division on Autism and Developmental Disabilities within the professional organization Council for Exceptional Children. Our distinguished speaker has traveled from North Carolina to be with us today, so please join me in the warmest welcome to our friend Jamie Peterson.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is so great to be back in my second home. I'm also a Mac user, Cheryl, so I'll see if I can do my very best.
Where to click is always
Yeah.
that one.
There we go. Okay, perfect. So I also want to just start by saying thank you so much to the Goldstick family. I know we tend to do thank yous at the end, but it really is an honor and a joy to be back here today and to give this lecture, so thank you so much. I also want to start with the land acknowledgement. The land that we stand on at North Carolina State University is land that was stewarded by the Tuscarora and the Catawba tribes, so I want to acknowledge that my university sits on the land of those tribes in North Carolina. So this is just a brief overview of our 40 or so minutes together this afternoon. I want to talk a bit about autism and disparities, what disparate experiences there are, particularly for Black and other marginalized groups of autistic youth. I want to talk a bit about what is FACES. I know you've probably heard this word FACES thrown around, so I'll share with you more about what FACES is and what we do. I'll also share some of the outcomes from FACES that we've learned so far through some of our early and ongoing research. And then we'll talk a bit about strategies and next steps. particularly for those of you who are training, who are pre-service teachers and SLPs. Want to share some strategies and next steps for the future. So in terms of language, when we think about autism and particularly around the neurodiversity movement, there has been an important movement towards recognizing and honoring the voices of disabled individuals, including those who identify as autistic and prefer to use identity-first language. So you'll hear me use both autistic, which is identity-first language, and people-first or person-first language, those with autism. And so I want to recognize that out of respect for individuals who are self-advocates and prefer identity-first language. I know many of you here are in the profession and in the field, but there may be those that are here that are not quite as familiar with autism, or those that are streaming online. And so just quickly, as a quick overview before I go into more of the details around FACES, autism is recognized as a communication or social communication disorder that affects communication and behaviors across the lifespan. We know that it's now 1 in 44 children, so we've seen that increasing prevalence over the years. I think when I first started here as a doc student in 2013, the prevalence was maybe 1 in the 100s, so that has increased drastically over the last several years. And we now know that across the world, autism impacts about 78 million people. And so we see that across spaces. There's also some new terminology related to autism that I wanted to share today called profound autism. So some of you may be more familiar with extensive support needs. And so the Lancet Commission on Future of Care and Clinical Research in Autism has called for the use of profound autism. And so this refers to individuals who identify as autistic, but who may also be minimally verbal or nonverbal, and who have co-occurring intellectual disability. These individuals typically require more significant support or 24-hour support with an adult who can care for them, for the rest of their lives. And sometimes they rely on other family members to help provide their communicative needs. And so this is often defined by an intellectual or language disability. So I'm going to embed a little bit of language around profound autism as we go throughout the lecture this afternoon. And so I wanted to make sure I provide a little bit of context for you when we talk about profound autism. So what do we know about communication outcomes in autistic children? I had to make sure I talk about communication outcomes because that's what this lecture is about. This is what we think about in terms of supporting Marissa and other individuals like Marissa in terms of that communication support. For early children, we know that early intervention improves social communication outcomes. For parents raising profoundly autistic children, however, we know that there are some disparate experiences in terms of how parents and families are able to access services and the extent to which those services impact long-term outcomes for those individuals. One question that has sort of led us to some of the next work that we'll talk about is what interventions and support strategies are effective for whom and when. So we talk a lot about evidence-based practices, but it's important for us to think about for whom are these practices evidence-based and when and in what settings are they evidence-based. So we'll talk a bit more about that as well. So what are some of these autism disparities? We see disparities in autism across race and ethnicity. So we know that according to the CDC, white children are about 30% more likely to be diagnosed with autism than black children, and about 50% more likely than Latinx children to be diagnosed with autism. We also see some disparities in terms of geography. So this is a map of North Carolina. And by the way, shout out to my family who's streaming online. I'm from the teeny tiny bottom south, right tip down there in Brunswick County. And so in rural North Carolina, in spaces like that, we see that the diagnosis and identification of autism is much less than in the more urban centers such as Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, where I currently live. We also see differences and disparities in terms of gender. We know that boys are much more likely to be diagnosed with autism. There's quite a bit more research around the identification of autism in girls and women, and more about thinking about what how masking can shape how we identify autism in individuals who identify as women. So a bit more context. I'm really kind of setting the stage here before we dive into FACES. In terms of this prevalence, right, we see that this surveillance around autism identification suggests that it really should be equal across racial and ethnic backgrounds. There should not, in theory, be differences in the identification of autism across individuals who come from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds, but we still see them. Despite this prevalence, however, there are disparities in service access. So individuals, particularly those who come from racially marginalized groups, Black and Latino particularly, often face challenges in terms of getting access to those services and may take longer time to receiving autism and related services. We've learned that one of the factors that contributes to this is often related to provider bias. So when we go into clinics, sometimes the diagnosticians, pediatricians, different related medical professionals, their diagnoses or identification practices may reflect some sense of provider bias. And this is related a bit to this idea of colorblind ideology, right? So this always stands out to me when I talk about colorblind ideology, because when I was here at the University of Illinois, I did some research, and I remember one of my participants, when I asked her about, her experiences with the students in her classroom, one of her replies was, "I don't see color," right? Which was a very well-intentioned sort of notion, but it's important for us to recognize that colorblindness is this racial ideology that suggests that the best way to end discrimination is really just by treating everyone equal despite our various cultural, ethnic, racial backgrounds and how that influences who we are, but also how we walk through and experience the world. So what are some of the implications then of this idea of colorblind ideology? It can in some ways create a society that denies negative racial experiences. It can in some ways reject our cultural heritage, and it invalidates our unique perspectives. Colorblind approaches to autism research have really led to this body of research that is not fully inclusive of individuals who reflect the diversity of autism. And so these are both social and systemic barriers. We see some limited knowledge of autism in historically marginalized communities, namely because the diagnosis and the identification is often lower, right? And so many Black and brown families say, well, I don't know anyone else with autism, or I'm not familiar with this. I'm not sure what this looks like. I'm not aware of what this means. And so we've seen both in focus groups with Black and Latino families that knowledge piece is really critical in being able to increase parents and family members' understanding, their advocacy, and their agency once they know more about what is autism, what are communication disorders, and how do we move forward. There's also a significant mental health stigma around disability broadly in multiple communities, but particularly in marginalized communities, racially marginalized communities. And so sometimes families are hesitant to want to seek a diagnosis because they're afraid of the stigma that might be attached to that. They're afraid of what it means for my child to be autistic or for my child to have autism. There are also some there's a need to increase knowledge among medical experts. I have a few friends who are medical doctors, and so I've asked them, like, how much do you actually learn about disabilities, particularly autism, in medical school? And one of them shared with me that it's basically in one course. They talk a bit about it. And so many of our families go to pediatricians as that primary source of knowledge. And so there's definitely a gap in terms of what we need to provide in terms of supports for medical professionals to be able to better support all individuals with disabilities, all individuals who identify as autistic, but particularly those who face marginalized outcomes who come from Black and brown communities. And then finally, we know that there are also some language barriers, right? So individuals who may not speak the same language as their providers. There are issues in terms of providing screenings and diagnostic materials in the same language of the children and the families. And so there are ongoing barriers related to social systems that affect the outcomes of Black and brown families supporting autistic children. So those are sort of on that social and system side. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk more about what these barriers mean in research. What do they look like for us who are engaging in this research? So this is from the Steinbrenner 22 study that was published recently, and so I was really excited to work with some colleagues on this paper. Brian Boyd, who was one of our former Goldstick, he was actually the lecturer the year that I was a fellow. So anyways, we worked on this project together, and we wanted to look at the racial and ethnic reporting and inclusion of in autism-related studies that use evidence-based practices. So this spanned from 1990 to 2017. And what we learned is that only about a quarter of these studies even reported race and ethnicity in the demographics, right? So 75% of all these studies did not even report racial and ethnic demographics based on the participants. We also learned that the inclusion of white participants was the highest overall, both across single case experimental design studies and group designs. And so there was very little representation out of more than 1,000 studies that actually included information about racial and ethnic representation. So you might say, like, what's the big deal, right? Why is this important? It's very challenging for us to be able to say these are evidence-based practices when we don't have representation in the participant samples, right? So it's really critical that we work to recruit samples, work to recruit families, work to support families who represent the population that we serve. And so this is a quote from the Steinbrenner study that says, "We assume that interventions are effective for all when they have been developed and validated primarily with and for white children." And then this is a quote from the Lord study that I mentioned earlier around, or the Lord report around profound autism. And they share that people with autism have complex needs. Meeting those needs requires government coordination between healthcare, education, finance, and social sectors across the lifespan, and active inclusion and participation of autistic people and their families. So it really is this coordinated effort across service sectors, across families, and of course including individuals with disabilities themselves to be able to more effectively access and maintain ongoing supports. So I have attempted to start to do some of this work through FACES. I'm really excited that this is something that we've been able to continue even since my dissertation here at the University of Illinois. And FACES stands for Fostering Advocacy, Communication, Empowerment, and Support. And this is a parent advocacy program that's really designed to address disparities in autism identification among Black families. It's designed to increase equity and access to services for Black families, to increase service utilization, and also to increase family empowerment and agency. So we really want families to have that knowledge and to experience that sense of agency that increases their ability to seek and access services. And then ultimately, the reason we're doing these things with families is to shape and strengthen social communication and behavioral outcomes in young, actually across the lifespan, but among Black autistic children. So in practice, this is sort of a visualization of what FACES looks like. We call this Big FACES because we have some different iterations, and I'll talk a little bit more about meeting FACES and some of the new arms of our project, but in my research lab, we call this Big FACES just so we know which FACES are we talking about right now. There's too many. So this is our Big FACES is our 4 to 6 week training program. We've part of this sort of iterative process as an early career fellow is really learning what works best, right? What's the right dosage? What does that look like? What's most feasible for our families? And so we've tried it both in a 4-week session and in a 6-week session. We're about to run it again as a 4-week this fall, and so I'll come back to you and let you know where we land. And so the purpose is really to increase that knowledge, the advocacy, the agency, and the empowerment that families are able to experience for those raising autistic youth. And so FACES includes training components that are related to social communication, but we really focus on outcomes that are related to the parents so that they feel better prepared to be able to seek services and to ultimately implement practices for their children. And so you can see at the bottom here, we talk about special education law, procedures, IEPs, advocacy, behavior management strategies, etc. And then this is meeting faces. This is why I have to have big faces and meeting faces and all the faces so we can keep them straight. So this one is more of a community engaged project that we've worked on. And so when I transitioned from Illinois back to North Carolina, I had to sort of get myself reoriented, and I wasn't ready to just jump back into the main big faces intervention, but we wanted to build some community connections. And so when I got back to North Carolina, lots of families were reaching out saying, I don't know where to go to get services. Where do I go for ABA? Where do I go for speech therapy? And so we brought a team of providers together from across service providers across disciplines. So special educators, general educators, physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech language pathologists, BCBAs. And they came with families from across the state in different settings to talk about what they provide. What service is it that I provide? And families were able to sort of make matches. It was almost like this version of like speed dating, if you will. Like people were able to make matches with service providers that they were wanting to be able to connect with for their children. And so this provides families with those opportunities to identify services that are available in their own communities. And then we were also, at the end of those experiences, able to learn more about what these families need. And so we asked them in a quick survey if they were interested to just share a bit more about what is it that you need in terms of access to services. And so I didn't share those data today for the sake of time. We'll probably talk a bit more about that tomorrow, but I will say that there were a number of services in North Carolina that the Black families who were participating in Meeting Faces said they needed, but were already represented. They just didn't know they were there, right? So they said, I want a social skills group for a young adult. And there are several providers who have those in our state, and especially in central North Carolina, but many families didn't know they existed. And so one of the things that we've been doing is building a resource website so that families know more about what is available in our community and having that be broadly accessible for everyone. So this is a data poem that we pulled from quotes from feedback that our participants gave us after they came to these Meeting Faces events. And I will say we've held 4 of these so far across the state of North Carolina. And so in our Meeting Faces events, we've been able to reach about 200 families. And in our Big Faces training, we've reached about 30 families, including those in our Chicago cohort. So close to 250 families so far have gone through either of our interventions. But from our Meeting Faces group, after they shared some feedback about what they learned, what was helpful, what they would want to see more of. And so different participants said the speakers, hearing from parents, the wealth of knowledge, sharing experiences and resources, to connect, laugh, cry, and understand, community feeling. So these are words directly from what participants experienced and what they thought was meaningful and important for them in terms of being a part of this Meeting Faces space and how they were able to really build this sense of community. And what spoke to me from some of these quotes was that empowerment is a critical piece, right? We know that empowerment is important for families, but also for individuals with disabilities. And so it's this central goal in families' efforts to be able to access and improve services for individuals with disabilities. But it's often the social injustices that marginalized families experience that makes it more difficult for them to experience this heightened sense of empowerment, but also makes them more susceptible to vulnerability. And so I like to think of empowerment as the foundation or prerequisite for advocacy, and I like to think of advocacy as a prerequisite for agency. And then when families feel empowered and they can advocate effectively and they feel that they have this sense of agency, then they're better prepared to be able to implement evidence-based practices that will ultimately lead to positive child outcomes. So what have we learned so far from this work, right? I've talked a bit about what FACES is and what it looks like in different contexts. We've learned that FACES strengthens family empowerment. And these data are from my dissertation study when we first piloted this. We learned that FACES increases the family empowerment scores and families' positive perceptions of empowerment. And so I'll just share one of these quotes with you. The support right here is huge because I just feel more confident about taking him places and just letting him be him. Before Faces, I didn't know how I was going to do it. So families really feel this sense of empowerment in terms of being able to better support their children. And so we were excited to see significant differences in scores in terms of the family empowerment scale pre and post Faces. We also learned that the intervention strengthens families' advocacy. So the special education, we used Dr. Burke's special education advocacy scale, and we found that the scores on that increased parents' perceptions of their advocacy. So they felt more confident in how well they were able to advocate for their children and for their needs. And so Catherine from this study said, the training in Faces has prepared parents that are here to go out and spread the good word to other parents of color, because sometimes that information was not available to them. And then sometimes because of the stigma of disability, they don't always go towards that information. And so to see this sense of advocacy really increase, and at least the perceptions of how well families are able to advocate, was really important and also inspiring. And then one of the things that we learned that we didn't necessarily hypothesize about Faces was that Faces builds community. Faces participants described this sense of community as really one of the best benefits of the intervention. For many of them, they hadn't met other families that looked like them. They hadn't, there was one father in particular who had never met another child with autism. And so it was really moving for many of them. And so one participant said, I think what I've received from this program or this training is good parents, good information, and more resources. I'm not the only parent out here. I know that other parents are reporting the same struggles that I am. Sorry, I lost my spot. We have an opportunity to share some of our different experiences with our kids at school, at home, and out in society. And I'm looking forward to keeping a lot of parent information so we can build that relationship and move forward as our kids kind of grow together. So it's like having a family. And I will say our Chicago cohort of Faces participants actually still communicate. Some of them like go to they have a Super Bowl party together every year. And so they really have built this ongoing sense of community that's really incredible over time. So you may be wondering again, like I talked a little bit earlier about what then are these child outcomes, particularly those related to child communication. This is kind of one of the things we're thinking about in terms of next steps. Right now, Faces is really focusing on increasing these outcomes in terms of parent-measured outcomes around empowerment, advocacy, caregiver implemented interventions is one of the things that we want to consider next. And so that will be in one of our new arms of this work. And ultimately, we want to be able to measure child communication outcomes. One of the things that we learned in both the pilot study and the second iteration of Faces is that parents are eager and hungry for so much information around how do I advocate effectively, how do I get from point A to point B in terms of navigating the service system, how do I get off of the wait list that I've been on for the Innovations Waiver in North Carolina for 7 years, right? How do I get services for my young adult child? They're so in the trenches of the day-to-day of supporting their children that many of them are not yet ready to sit down and engage in naturalistic teaching strategies or engage in evidence-based practices. And so my argument is that a program like Faces or interventions like this are really the prerequisite to families being able to engage more often in caregiver implemented communication interventions. And I think that will come. I think that is going to be, maybe if anybody has a recommendation for the next Faces for me to call, I need a new name, but our next arm will really be much more targeted to those communication outcomes in children. Jim looks like he might have one in heaven. So we will work on that as we move forward. But I just wanted to kind of lay that out in terms of understanding that this really is an iterative process, and we want to learn more about how parent knowledge and empowerment and advocacy can then shape these outcomes, particularly related to communication in children. So what are these next steps? Right now I'm in phase 2 of the IES Early Career Grant, and so we're actually manualizing Faces. My research team is working on that back at home, so shout out to them. We are, really trying to make this a usable, feasible intervention that I could hand off to anyone in this room who could then implement the intervention. So that will be ongoing for the rest of this year. We're then going to test FACEs with community-based providers, and I'll talk a little bit about who those providers are and why it's important to partner with community-based providers in these spaces. And then we're going to test FACEs in a randomized control trial. So we're going to hand it off to community-based partners. We're going to make sure we have some strong fidelity of implementation, and then we're going to test it with a large group of participants in phase 4. So we have a little ways to go before we get to that. And then one of the other sort of related projects with FACEs is really thinking about how we can support the needs of individuals with profound autism. And so we have worked on some projects and submitted some grants around FACEs Pro, which will really be dedicated to supporting Black families who have profoundly autistic youth, and thinking about what that might look like, what this intervention could look like or might look like for those families. And then finally, in another sort of secondary arm of this intervention, we want to focus more on youth enrichment for the children. So one of the components of our intervention is that in terms of overcoming barriers that many marginalized families face in terms of intervention research is that we provide childcare, we provide food, we provide stipends for parking, we make sure that we host our trainings in spaces that are accessible via public transportation. So we really try to think about any potential barrier or obstacle that a family might face, and we try to provide a solution for that. And so in building on that, we don't want it to just be respite or just sort of childcare, but we want to think about more youth enrichment activities. And so my team is working to build STEM enrichment so that we can help students learn more about STEM, engaging in science, technology, engineering, and math while their parents are in the FACES training. So it will ultimately become a 2-part training. So now for some strategies. I've kind of talked at you for several minutes about what we've done and where we're going, but I hope that you can go away today with some usable strategies that perhaps you can use in your classrooms or in your practice. And so I want to share a little bit about some strategies for culturally responsive research, but also clinical practice. So when we think about autism research, on a day-to-day basis, at least from my perspective, this business as usual typically lacks racial and ethnic diversity in terms of the representation. It often lacks gender diversity in terms of demographic representation, and it's often not inclusive of autistic students with extensive support needs or those who have profound autism. And so our approach through FACES and through the work that we've been doing in the FACES lab is to be very intentional about recruitment. So if it takes more time to recruit a more representative sample, then that's fine. We start our study a little later, but we want to ensure that we have representative participants. It means that we provide adaptations and support. Cheryl mentioned in the introduction the NSF project, and I won't go off on that, but I do just want to say that working to be very intentional about recruiting students from marginalized racial and ethnic backgrounds, but also ensuring that students who may have more profound support needs are still included in interventions like GIST, right? So any student should have an opportunity to learn about how to build and fly drones if they want to, and it is my responsibility to ensure that we have whatever supports are needed to ensure that that's possible for them. So really thinking about what those adaptations and supports are is critical. We also have to consider logistics, right? So some of the things I mentioned earlier in terms of those barriers around transportation and childcare. So these are the do's. We want to think about that. And then finally, having a diverse research team. So having a racially, ethnically diverse team, having a gender diverse team, and having a neurodiverse team are really the do's that I like to think about in terms of this work. So I've been very fortunate to build and partner with the team that represents diversity in many facets, and it really is incredibly important because it represents the families that we support, and they feel like they have voices that are not only on the team, but that are part of their community. And so I would like to sort of put this approach out there as something for many of you to consider, particularly as researchers in your ongoing work. And so here are a few other culturally responsive components that are a little bit harder to read, so I apologize about that. And I won't walk through all of these, but I just want to highlight a number of them, right? So culturally responsive research has to be collaborative. It's not something we do in silos. It's not something we do alone. I haven't done a single project around supporting marginalized families by myself. So I'm absolutely always partnering with community-based providers, with families. I'm always building advisory boards that include participants or those like our participants. And so I really want to encourage you to remember that it takes collaborative work to engage in this, in research around supporting marginalized families. It also begins with building rapport. You absolutely have to build rapport in communities. And so although I'm from North Carolina, I had to go back and kind of start over and kind of build rapport in the schools and in the communities. I even tried to host a Meeting Faces event in my own county, in Brunswick County where I grew up, but we didn't do a very good job recruiting in it. So we had to kind of start over and think about what is it that we need to do in terms of building those partnerships. It requires an understanding of intersectionality, right? We don't experience disability or needs in silos, but we also don't live in silos, right? So we have to think about what are the pieces of our identity and how do they intersect to shape what our needs are, but also how we experience the world. And so this is a really critical part when we think about both disability and race and gender and faith, right? So all of these pieces really shape our understanding and how we walk in this space. Culturally responsive research also includes stakeholder groups. So it's important to have stakeholder groups, or what we might call advisory boards, that represent those with whom we're working. And this means from inception to dissemination. This does not mean let me design a research project and then ask after the fact, like, do you think that looks good? No, this means at the very outset having research questions that are designed with your stakeholder groups, making sure that their voices are heard and that they're at the table from the very beginning. We also want to make sure that we ensure accessibility of research design. And so this goes back to the piece around individuals with profound autism and making sure that anyone is able to participate and that we have an inclusive space. We want to measure social and ecological validity. So for many of our families who are saying, actually the community part of FACES is really what's been helpful for me, we responded to that by saying, okay, we're going to have more of like a support group session at the beginning of every FACES event. So they get to have 30 minutes at the beginning of every FACES where they vent about the week before. They might talk about what happened in an IEP meeting. They might talk about how they advocated in their community. And so those are the responses to what families' needs are that we think, that I would argue, are really critical in being responsive to the needs of culturally and ethnically diverse families. We also want to ensure sustainability. So how can this be an ongoing intervention? What does that look like? And for us, we're hoping that that means community-based providers can implement FACES. And then we also want to include racially, ethnically, diverse racial, ethnic, sexual orientation, gender, and neurodiverse research team members. So everyone from all walks of life. I make it a very intentional practice to know that anyone is welcome in my lab, and that we have an inclusive space that's dedicated to supporting the needs of neurodiverse families who come from marginalized backgrounds. So I know I'm running short on time, but in my last 5 minutes or so, I'll talk a little bit more about how we can engage in developing these inclusive research designs. And we're really excited about this paper. It's literally hot off the press. It was published online yesterday, and it's called The Scholarly Neglect of Black Autistic Adults in Autism Research. And one of my first master's students after I left Illinois, Kayla Malone, authored this paper along with the rest of our team, and she's now at Chapel Hill working on her PhD. And so one of the things I'll share on the next slide, some of the points that we talk about in this paper, but one of the points of this is really to highlight that we have, as a field, a profession, not done the best job of A, including Black voices in autism research, but B, not including Black autistic adult voices in research. And so in this work, we talk about what that looks like and how we might move the field forward in that space. And so these are some of the ways that Kayla and the rest of our team have talked about developing accessible and inclusive research designs. So the first way that you might consider doing that is adapting the practices of the research team. So how are you engaging in research? How are you and where are you recruiting, right? If you're recruiting from the Autism Society for every single study and your demographics look the same every single time, then maybe we should recruit somewhere else. So we have to think about adapting those practices. We have to diversify our team, as I just mentioned. We have to construct ethnically and racially inclusive design. So in many cases, there are some interventions and some types of research and some spaces that may not be feasible for some families to participate in. Or maybe they're burnt out on surveys, or maybe they're burnt out on interviews. And so we have to think about what types of research and what types of designs are actually feasible for the families that we're partnering with. And so we consider that feasibility and accessibility for families. We center marginalized voices and ensure that their voices are at the forefront of the work that we do. And then we want to develop intentional partnerships with marginalized groups to ensure that their preferences are heard, that their preferences and needs are a part of the work that we're doing. And so that goes back to having those advisory boards who can help sustain that work. So for those of you who are in clinical practice or training the BBCBAs or speech language pathologists, what might you do, right? What could you do today in practice? You can dispel some of the assumptions that you might have when you walk into a home or you walk into a practice of families about their communication styles, about family values, right? So just really taking into account for what your biases may be and what assumptions you might have walking into that space. It's also really critical to acknowledge our cultural beliefs that are already embedded in the daily lives of marginalized families. And so as practitioners or clinicians, it's not our jobs to go into a family's home, for example, and sort of try to change the orientation or the dynamics of what their sort of cultural norms are, right? It's our job to learn more about what that means for them and how might my intervention, how might my research, how might my practice fit into these families' lives and their cultural practices. We also want to demonstrate culturally responsive techniques in a manner that feels most comfortable to family members, right? So some families, for some of them, it's very new to have someone, particularly if you're in early childhood and early intervention, it might be very new and out of the norm to have, a provider coming into their home all of a sudden, right? So thinking about what that might mean. And then finally, we need to acknowledge these diverse needs. Every family, no matter what walk of life, racial, ethnic background, orientation, geographic location, we all have diverse needs. And so it's incredibly important to be able to acknowledge those, but for us to be flexible to what those needs might be and thinking about how we can adapt them, particularly for marginalized families. And so one of the things that we've tried to do, and that I encourage all of you to do, is really leverage community connections. And so we've worked to do this in North Carolina with the Autism Society of North Carolina, with our PTI there, the Exceptional Children's Assistance Center, and then with the Teach Autism program at UNC Chapel Hill. And so building these partnerships helps us to ensure that we're reaching families across service systems, across community agencies who maybe aren't just able to be reached through, through their school system or through one partnership. And so I think it's really important to think about how might I leverage community connections and community supports in ways that enable us to address the needs of marginalized families. And finally, I really encourage you, if nothing else, to challenge the status quo, right? So anything that you might be used to, right? If you feel that this is not really working towards addressing the needs of racially and historically marginalized families, what can you do differently, right? How can I sit in a space of discomfort to think about addressing the needs of families who are marginalized in autism research and in access to services? So really thinking about how do I push that button forward. So finally, I just want to say thank you to our FACES families. The work that I do is completely impossible without them and their ongoing support and interest. I have family members who reach out and actually ask, what can I do for FACES, which is really incredible for me as a researcher to have participants reaching out and wanting to be more involved with our research. I also want to say thank you to my FACES Research Lab. They had our team meeting today without me, but they're moving our work forward, and I'm incredibly grateful for them and for all the work that they do. And then last but absolutely not least, thank you to the Goldstick family for not only this opportunity, but for the opportunity to be a Goldstick Fellow back in 2015, and also to the late Mrs. Goldstick. It really is an honor and a joy to be back in this space, and I really am grateful for all of you.
Let's give her another round of applause. So we tried something new this year, and thank you for everybody who has entered a question. I have many that we won't get time to, but I will compile and give to Jamie. So you're just gonna have to trust me. I'm just gonna kind of pick a few. They were all very interesting, though. Some of them I probably won't ask because I know it'll be a longer answer, and we may not have time for that. But we'll go through as many as we can. One of the questions was, in your meeting faces, professionals, did you have professionals that looked like the families? And would that have an impact on whether somebody would want to access services?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. So the question was, were the providers and the professionals from meeting faces Black and brown providers? Most of them were not. Most of them were white providers, and that's an incredibly important point to think about in moving forward. Is, does that make families more inclined to participate? I will say, I can't remember if I had an image in this slide deck, though, where there was a picture of our first Meeting Faces event where we were actually breaking the fire code because there were so many families there. So they were eager to be there anyway, but I do think that's an incredibly important piece, is to think about cultural matching and to what extent that might encourage even more participation. Great question.
Another question was somebody knowing that you had some idea of what was going on in the CU area when you were here, and how you might compare the quality of services between here and, they call it the triangle, research triangle,
Yes.
which they must know more the terminology than I do.
Yeah.
Any particular, similar differences, and any improvements you can suggest for the local area based on your past experience?
I mean, I think one of the things about living in Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill is that Teach really is a hub for autism services there. And so families actually move to the area for supports. And so we tend to, in some ways, be oversaturated in terms of reaching families, but often those who are not racially and ethnically marginalized. And so I think that's one difference, right? Just the setting is different. I will say, I thought it would be easier for me to recruit here in Champaign-Urbana, and one of the reasons I went up to Chicago was because it was really hard for me to recruit Black families in this space. And I think that speaks to me having not done enough of that rapport building as a doc student, and building more of those connections. I think that's a really important piece. So I think those are kind of two of the differences I would note.
Has your FACES program been part of any early identification or diagnosis of autism within marginalized families?
So we did do another arm of FACES. It's an octopus at this point. We did work. I partnered with our school psychology program in either my first or second year at State, and so we had some funding where we actually were able to provide diagnostic services we provided vouchers for 7 families who were able to come in and have their children identified, and then better able to access services. Yeah.
Sibling programs. Have you thought about another FACES arm that goes into the siblings area?
It's definitely something that we've considered. I think right now we have to get through the iterative early career grant, and then really think about what a sibling FACES might look like. So it's definitely something we've considered.
Can FACES potentially expand into intervention for Latino families?
So there is the LP, LSP, and I know Dr. Magana did her talk a few years back. And so we did try actually in one of our Meeting Faces events to include both Black and Brown families, Latino families. And one of the things that I think I noticed that was important was really being true to what who our program is for, and understanding that developing culturally responsive programs and interventions requires intentionality. And so I don't want it to ever be an afterthought, or that we are missing families, or that we're not providing spaces and languages that are accessible. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that I have other colleagues who are doing a really good job at that work, and that we're not doing the best job at this work for Black families. And so I think we're being very intentional about Faces for Black families for that reason.
How can I, as another person of color, support marginalized families of preschool going children, so those going into a school system who are on the spectrum, using your intersectionality lens?
So I think part of that starts with building rapport, right? I think cultural matching is one piece of that, but no matter who we are and no matter who we're working with, we still have to start with building a sense of rapport and trust. And so I think that's step one. I think the other piece is really sitting with families and understanding what their needs are. Like, maybe they aren't interested in actually participating in Faces. Maybe they just want to sit and chat about, how do I get connected to this service? Or how can I talk to a case manager? And so sometimes it means me taking off my researcher hat or my professor hat and just sitting and having a conversation with a family member as another human being, right? And just really connecting them to those supports. So I think sometimes we have to take off our professional hats and sit in spaces where we connect with each other.
This is very efficient. How many minutes do we have left?
0.
So maybe 5 minutes. How intertwined is the political climate around autism and maybe what you are doing?
How intertwined is the political climate? I mean, I do think conversations around this type of intervention research can be uncomfortable for some people. I actually remember when I started this work, one of the questions that I got was like, why is this important? Why is it important that we talk about autism or communication disorders in Black families in particular? What really does that mean? And I think when we speak to the political climate in terms of social justice and equity, it's incredibly important to push the envelope on making sure that services, that education is accessible for all families. And I think Faces is really doing that work in the autism space, where we know we're constantly growing and learning more about what that looks like. I think it also means that we have to have more racially and ethnically diverse researchers who are doing the work, more racially and ethnically diverse teachers who are in the classroom. And so it really involves systems level changes to really push this envelope forward in terms of social justice for Black and Brown families, but particularly for those who are raising children with disabilities.
Let's see. Somebody was interested in your definition of profound autism and how that may or may not be related to our old, outdated terms of profound disabilities that we used to use as a category.
Yeah, so I think it's definitely still sort of a newer term. Lord and colleagues have coined this, so it's definitely not my term, but I think the point is that we're really trying to, there's sort of this polarization of what it means to be, I know we don't use high functioning autism anymore, but the equivalent of, right? So for individuals who have fewer support needs, there's a conversation in the field around how the neurodiversity movement often only represents individuals who are socially communicative, or who are speakers, right? Or who have the ability to live independently, who may not need caregiving support ongoing. And to that extent, although we've recognized that we're better able to affirm neurodiversity, to some extent we've left behind or not included the voices and experiences of those who have more extensive support needs. So at the end of the day, it's semantics, honestly, to me. It's semantics. But the point is that we absolutely have to be more inclusive of individuals with extensive support needs, with profound autism, with whatever language we use. And I think we're in a space where a lot of it is around like what's the right word and like tiptoeing around that, but at the end of the day we have to make sure we have inclusive spaces and that we're doing the work that addresses the needs of every person across the spectrum, and that we don't just engage in work that maybe only represents those who are speakers or those who may be able to advocate for themselves.
Isn't she fabulous? I'm just I want to encourage you to continue to put questions in there. That was what we had time for, and I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun for me to see what your questions are. If I didn't get to one of your questions, I apologize. We do have limited time. I'm going to have somebody start going like this here pretty soon. So thank you, Jamie. It was so thought-provoking. I'm going to watch the video too because I was a little busy doing some other things, but it was very fascinating. You've given us many ideas to consider in all of our work, I believe, working with individuals with disabilities and their families. We can't forget those families. Therapists, special educators, parents, faculty, volunteers, community members. This has an impact on everybody. So we already did that. Before announcing this year's Goldstick Fellows, I would like to acknowledge my Goldstick Scholar predecessors, Jim Halley, Mickey Ostrowski, and Hedda Medan Kaplansky. I think the only person physically here is Mickey. Would you please stand up? And if Jim and Hedda are streaming in here, hello and thank you. It has been a really hard act to follow, so I appreciate all their mentorship. They have a wealth of information as I continue the tradition of the Goldstick Family Lecture. It has been an honor to serve in this role, and I thank you very, very much. All right, I think we are, drum roll, for our fellows. More than 15 years ago, Phil and Beverly Goldstick established a fund in the College of Education and the Department of Special Education in honor of their granddaughter, Marissa, who has Rett syndrome, a genetic disorder that affects the development and use of language, as well as many other areas of functioning. Phil and Beverly wanted their gift to impact the future of children and young adults like Marissa. We also want to acknowledge the essential role that Beverly Goldstick played in the family's generosity. Beverly was not only a loving and caring wife, mother, and grandmother, she also became a good friend to many of us here at the University of Illinois. She has been a dear friend to our department and is deeply missed. So we want to acknowledge her. In addition to supporting the Goldstick Lecture each year, the Goldstick family supports doctoral students who receive the title of Goldstick Fellows. This year we were able to select 4 doctoral students to receive this fellowship, 1 from the Department of Speech and Hearing Science and 3 from our Department of Special Education. All have strong interest in communication disorders and disabilities. I'd like to recognize this year's Goldstick Fellows, and if you could please stand up, I would appreciate it. As I call your name, Rebecca Bosley, Melanie Martin, Adriana Kaori Terrell, I'm so sorry. She left, I'm scared. And Christy Yoon. Christy Yoon has also received the Research Award, the Zellinger Research Award, with her mentor, Hedda Medan Kaplansky. So they have a very interesting study that they have planned to use the funds for, and so we're very excited to see how that all turns out. I think I'm almost to the end here. Let me just tell you what that research is. I do have that written down here. They'll be working on a project that was designed to develop a comprehensive social communication profile of young children with neurodevelopmental disabilities by including eye-tracking measures of social attention and both caregiver and teacher reports of social communication skills in natural settings. Am I correct? Okay. It sounds so interesting. We wish you ever success on that project. It is now my pleasure to invite Phil Goldstick to come to the podium to give us some remarks.
Does the microphone come on?
I think it,
No. All right, we were trying to avoid this.
it's going to go anyway.
Thank you very much. What a great program that Jamie brought. One of the things I'd like to say, I usually like to comment a little bit about the program, and this is one that's certainly one that should be talked about and should be brought out in the communities and given more information about it. And there were a lot of good points. And I think that one of the things that I came away with is the barriers. In order to make progress with these children, particularly, the barriers are there. And one of the things that I think is a simple answer but very complicated is education. And this institution is involved with one of the greatest education programs in the country, and doing a hell of a job. And I think that the faces are the people that Jamie is talking about, those families and people in the community, regardless of what their race or ethnicity is, should get involved to help these things. Now, coincidentally, I don't know if that's the right word, my grandson, the son of my daughter Karen and my son-in-law Alan, who's the younger brother of Marissa, left Wall Street, where he had a growing career in business, and started a group of service organizations for autistic children. And he now has 10 service offices in 3 states serving young children with services and families. And we're so proud of that, but it's part of what we're about. And all of us that are here who have been involved with this for the last 18 years, we've seen it grow, and thank you. Now, I don't know how many of you know this, but this program was started more than 18 years ago. And it was started because Beverly and I wanted to fund a program to help with communication disorders based upon Marissa's problem with Rett syndrome. And we were having difficulty to find a program to do that. And there was a guy by the name of Sid Misek, who at the time was the president of the University of Illinois Foundation, which, by the way, I'm a life member of that board since 1989. I went to Sid and I asked him if he could find a program for what we wanted to do. And he came up with a program, but he couldn't do it alone. The program was developed by then Dean Susan Fowler and Development Officer Joan Tausey, both of who are here today. And unfortunately, however, we're very proud that Kathy Misek, Sid's wife, is here, And I would like them to stand and get a round of applause because they're the glue that made this program possible, and we love them. I don't know what else I can say, but every person in this room, every person that's worked in our programs, everyone that's touched our lives has made us proud. And we're very proud to be here and be able to share this with each and every one of you. And I wish you the best of health and good luck.
Wow, what a moment. That was wonderful. Thank you to Dr. Jamie Peterson for an informative talk. I think I speak on behalf of the college when I say that we're so proud of you. And I speak as a dean, saying how proud I am for all the work that's happening in this college and the mentorship that goes around to help prepare such outstanding candidates. Thank you, Phil, for your reflection and for your generosity. We appreciate your commitment to education and especially the work in communication disorders. I would like to thank you all again, those in person and those online, for joining us today, and really look forward to seeing you all again next year. Thank you.